Alright guys, we have confirmation that Hirugami will be the next UR character coming out, so let me quickly review his skills to give you some of my thoughts on whether or not they are good or not, and then at the end of the video I will also talk about whether or not I think his value have increased or decreased as a result of the no position limit update on the JP side, okay? So let's start off with all of his skills. Now I'm not actually going to read out yourself because it's actually quite long for some of the skills, but you guys can read it yourself. I will just give you my straightforward opinion. The first half, this is just increasing awareness, so this can potentially help it trigger his surf ability a bit nicer, so I'll talk about that in skill 2. Second half of skill 1 is basically you're able to get a stack whenever you block, and this effect lasts until someone scores on your side, okay? Now, even though this says up to maximum 5 stack, because this only lasts till you score, so depending on whether or not you won that rally, or maybe you have lost that rally and then won the rally afterwards, it's going to vary a lot in terms of how many stacks you can actually build up. So even though the maximum says 5 stacks here, vast majority of the time I'll probably say you will only see somewhere around the range of 1 to 3 stacks, okay? So that's just something for you to bear in mind. Skill 2, basically you have a jump serve, and if you actually manage to land a crit, then you're able to force the enemy team morale awaken to finish, and also they won't be able to gain team morale. Basically just anti-Bokuto and Fukudani teams. Now this by itself is still actually pretty nice purely for the fact that this is a mid blocker and not many mid blockers actually have serving skill right now. So I guess from that perspective, I believe the only other mid blocker with serving skill is Yamaguchi right now. So obviously Yamaguchi is only an SR character. So depending on your turn rotation, it's actually quite nice to ensure that your mid blocker position can always make sure to get a serve without needing to do any kind of pinch server kind of substitution, etc. And instead you can save your pinch server substitution for a different position. So that's that. That's skill 2. Now skill 3, basically whenever the ball cross over the net, you are able to get 1 stack of buff, and depending on how many stacks there are, you're going to get different effect. 2 stacks will increase your block, 3 stacks increase your receive, 4 stacks will increase your spike, and then also at the end of the rally, all of them will be consumed to turn into attack technique and also defense technique as well. Now this is actually a really strong buff. Now the reason is, first of all, the attack technique and defense technique part, this is one of the stats which is the hardest for you to get multipliers in. So the fact that you are actually able to get this kind of buff normally means a great more better amount of buff in comparison to, let's say, a buff for crit damage, because there are already so many other characters who are already able to buff up crit damage, whereas not many can actually buff up attack or defense technique. So this part is already very good. Furthermore, it lasts for a whole rally, which basically means that by the second time you, or the turn right afterwards, when you actually trigger this, what you're then going to see is that you have all of a sudden basically a buff in the attack technique and defense technique component, and also a buff in terms of the actual raw stats component. And if you remember my previous video on damage calculation, you do know that it's normally a lot better for you to have buffs across different multipliers rather than all of them to be concentrated and saturated in a single multiplier, okay? So that's kind of why, even if you ignore the numerical value here, the numerical value, to be honest, is also quite high. But if you actually take into consideration the fact that 2 multipliers will be times multiplying with each other rather than addition, then you realize Hirugami is actually able to provide even more value in terms of his buff as well, okay? And also theoretically, this doesn't even have a limit. I mean, I know it's unlikely that a single rally will go on for too long, but in theory, this doesn't even have any limit, so you can go as high as you want with his skill 3 buffs, okay? It's also really easy to trigger, okay? You literally just have to go for a net crossing. So every single turn, it's going to be a minimum 1 net crossing, right? Even if the enemy, let's say, get a surface, that's still 1 net crossing. So you're always able to get some kind of attack technique or defense technique buff. And assuming the enemy doesn't get a surface, then you're also guaranteed to be pretty much able to do a block power increase, and then potentially even receiving buff as well, depending on who was the one that started the serve. So this is definitely a very good skill. And then in terms of his ultimate skill, basically is a very strong multiplier, especially if the enemy is actually doing a power spike. Now you might be thinking, what if the enemy is actually doing a quick spiking team? The reality is, even for quick spiking team right now, unless you are going to build all of your mid blocker with a quick spiking potential, which is, to be honest, quite rare because a lot of times you will still build them up with a strong block. So that basically means even up against a quick spiking team, a lot of time you will still be facing up against some of power spike attacks. So this, even though it's only going to be additional damage when the enemy is actually doing power spiking, it's pretty much more or less guaranteed that every team you face will have at least one strong power spike. Okay, so this is still very easy for you to trigger, and also once again the multiplier is huge. If you actually add it up, it's going to be 300%, which is the highest in the game right now. Okay, so that's all of his skill 1 to 4. Then let's move on to skill resonance. 2 dupes, what's going to happen is that you're going to get even higher awareness when the enemy is already on the Team Morale Awakening. That makes it easier for you to land that crit and therefore force the enemy to come out of Team Morale Awakening. And then what's going to happen is that depending on whether or not you won the point or lost a point, you're either going to get 1 extra stack of his skill 3 passive, or you are going to get a reduction in terms of the cooldown for your ultimate attack. Both are actually going to be very, very nice effect because remember, like I said earlier, if you actually get 1 extra stack of his passive, what's going to happen is that it's going to reduce the warm-up period for you to actually trigger all of those conditions. Also, it's going to be a minimum an extra 5% attack technique and also defense technique every single turn as well. So that is definitely something which is pretty nice. And then let's say if you actually won the point, then obviously reducing your cooldown. I think the normal cooldown is 12 net crossing. If you're able to reduce it by 6, that's already halving your ult cooldown, okay? So this is also a very good acceleration in terms of the frequency you're able to trigger your ultimate attack. So both of them are actually going to be very, very nice. And that's kind of what I normally recommend. Try to go for skill resonance 2 if possible. Now, let's move on to skill resonance 4, which is basically 6 dupe. First of all, you're able to increase your own defense technique, which is nice, especially if you are planning to use Hirugami for a lot of the blocks, even, for example, using his normal block, etc. Then the other thing, which is somewhat situational, is that whenever the enemy is actually going to do a spike, you're able to apply a debuff, which is just a 5% reduction. This is actually quite nice, but the reduction is actually quite low, so it's going to be up to you whether or not you think it's useful. Then the second half is actually going to be quite interesting, which is that if the person spiking is already under that debuff, your ult is actually going to reduce your cooldown by 10 times. Now, whilst this sounds amazing on paper, you have to bear in mind the debuff itself only lasts for 4 net crossing. So unless the enemy just for whatever reason have an ult cooldown of also less than 4 net crossing, otherwise there's no way they will still be under the influence of the debuff by the time they spike again. So basically, if you had to smite it this way, basically his skill resonance 4 is just used to counter against any character who is actually capable of spamming ultimate attack. So for example, Ushijima skill resonance 2 or Bokuto skill resonance 4, etc. Okay, if you do not have an enemy, if you do not face up against an enemy who's actually capable of spamming ultimate attack, then the second half of the skill resonance is pretty much useless. And that's kind of what I don't really think is worth going all the way up to 6 dupe for Hirugami. For me, the sweet spot is either going to be 0 dupe or for 2 dupes, depending on whether or not you have the resources, okay? Then the other thing is going to be this duo effect with Hoshiyumi. This one's also very nice. It improves Hoshiyumi a lot more than it improves Hirugami, because what it allows you to do is have a huge amount of buff to Hoshiyumi's all of his stats. And remember, because Hoshiyumi is a bit of an all-rounder, improvement to all of his stats is massive for him. And then second thing is that you're also able to increase your blocks to make it even stronger. This one, to be honest, is going to be somewhat diluted from the fact that Hoshiyumi is already able to apply so much buff. So the main thing that it really shows is more the buff to Hoshiyumi, and that's kind of why I say this dual effect is going to be more beneficial to Hoshiyumi than to Hirugami. Same thing for the second half as well. It's actually quite easy for Hirugami to get his 1 stack of his skill 3 because you just need 1 net crossing. Whereas for Hoshiyumi, it actually requires him to actually use his skill 2 first. So once again, the second half benefit Hoshiyumi a lot more than benefiting Hirugami, okay? Now let's talk about how good is actually Hirugami, especially when you actually put him in perspective of other mid blockers that you can also potentially summon for. Now let's start off with just some calculations. Now in terms of how did I actually reach these numbers, I have already talked about this in one of my previous video of the methodology, etc. If you are interested, then I'll link that video in the comment section and you guys can check it out. But one of the main things that you guys want to take from this is that you don't pay too much attention in terms of the actual numbers here, because all all of the numbers here are kind of like a minimum value without taking into consideration of any, team bonds, school bonds, or any teammates buff effect at all. So this is purely based on the character themselves. Whereas in actual matches, because of all of the buff from the rest of your teammate and synergy, etc., the numbers will be a lot higher. However, what this calculation does allow you to do is basically compare characters next to each other, because assuming you'll be having the same teammates and same bonds, etc., the ranking between the characters is still going to stay the same once you actually factor in all of those teammates, okay? So basically, don't pay too much attention in terms of the absolute values, numerical value here, but use this more for comparison reason to see which one's higher. But anyway, so basically the way I've done it for Hirugami is that you probably already realized Hirugami have loads of different buffs from both his skill 1 and also skill 3, and also his memory, which I didn't talk about, but basically he also have some kind of like buff stacks from his memory. And the same with all of those stacks is that they actually add more value, potentially more value to Hirugami than the rest of his teammate. So depending on how many stacks of all of those buff are, you're going to see slightly different ranking in terms of how good Hirugami is in comparison to other characters. But let's start off with some kind of the basic case, okay? Yeah, all right. So if we just take a look at, let's say, if I don't play Hirugami at all, if I just play with a UR mid blocker such as Kuro, what we are effectively see is that a normal block from him is going to have somewhere around 22k damage. If we just take a look, if we just have Hirugami by himself, then the value of Hirugami can go all the way from 18k to 32k, okay? So obviously, even at 18k, yes, that is going to be slightly less than the mid blocker, however, it's not much less. However, also, if you ever get into long rally where you can actually stack up all of your buff, the number here is like almost 50% higher than the next best UR mid blocker right now, which is actually going to be Crow. So that's kind of why, if we're just talking about one singular UR mid blocker on the field, Hirugami is able to output a lot higher block, vast majority of the time in comparison to UR Crow. Okay, so that's already one straightforward comparison you can make. However, the other interesting thing is that, let's say if you actually have both UR Crow and Hirugami, and let's say you have Hoshiyumi as well. Now, I'm not taking in terms of into consideration the deployment bump between Hirugami and Hoshiyumi. I'm just talking about, let's say, if you also build Hoshiyumi as a mid blocker, then what you actually go and realize is that because Hirugami is able to provide so much buff, not just to himself, but also to the whole team. Even when you go all the way up to maximum stacks, the block value from Hirugami is actually going to be less than the block value from Kuro, and even less than the block value from Hoshiyumi, if you actually build Hoshiyumi with a full block set as well, okay? And that difference is going to be even larger if you don't actually have all those stacks on Hirugami. And this is also going to be very interesting, because what you now realize is that, yes, if we're just talking about Hirugami by himself, he is actually going to have a stronger block, arguably, in comparison to any other blocker. But also at the same time, if you actually play him alongside with other blockers, what's going to happen is that he will be given so much buff to all of the other blockers to make them having even stronger value than what Hirugami is able to produce by himself. So that kind of shows you the actual position of how you want to value Hirugami. To me, I don't actually value Hirugami as a pure blocker, purely because so much of his skill effect is actually coming from all of the buff he's able to bring. So the best way of you actually deciding whether or not you want to go for Hirugami is actually going to be more looking at the long-term value of all of those buff that he's able to bring. And then this also brings us to the next topic I want to cover, which is that whether or not the update on JP side, where they have removed position limit update, did they actually make the value of Hirugami go up or actually go down? Now, one thing is that there are actually loads of really good SP mid blocker coming up in the future. So from that perspective, and also I guess if you actually take a look at, if I do play Hirugami alongside with other mid blockers, or even Hoshiyumi with a full block build, all of them can actually arguably do better blocks than what Hirugami is able to offer. So if we just talk about from this perspective by itself, then you will realize that all of the other future SP blockers are going to be much better at blocking than Hirugami as well. However, what Hirugami is able to bring once again onto the table is the fact that he's able to offer so much passive buff without even needing himself to be the one blocking, okay? Remember, his skill 1 just triggers whenever you do a block. It doesn't have to be Hirugami, just someone on your team do a block. And his skill 3 just triggers whenever you do a net crossing. So it's actually ridiculously easy for you to build up all of his buffs without him even doing anything. So that basically makes him very, very valuable from like a buffer point of view. And I could even argue a lot of the buff he's able to provide is on par with the setters. And a lot of the setters give insane amount of buff in this game, okay? So that already shows you the value he's able to bring. Once again, if I just take an example here, normally Kuro is only able to block for 22k. With the combination of Hirugami at the highest level, you're able to increase that by 50%, okay? Just imagine a 50% increase to all of your blocks. And I am using block as an example, but if you once again remember, the buff Hirugami is able to provide is actually for attack technique and defense technique at the same time, and also all of the stats for the character. So this 50% increase can arguably also be applied to all of your spikes as well, and also your receive. So the value of Hirugami is able to bring is actually going to be a lot more obvious when you actually consider him as a buffer point of view rather than as a blocker. And that's kind of why, even though right now on JP side, after position limit removal, and you can bring, let's say, multiple blockers onto the field, I actually think Hirugami still have a place there, because even if he's not actually being used as a blocker himself, because his block is arguably still lower than other future SP mid blockers, but other future SP mid blockers are only able to hit that value because of the passive buff from Hirugami, and that's kind of what makes him so valuable in my opinion. Now, just to complete the topic, some of the other future mid blockers also are able to bring some kind of buff. For example, the likes of SP Kuro and also Aone. However, the buff they give is going to be a lot less than Hirugami. And sometimes it's also going to be a lot more conditional. For example, the buff from SP Kuro actually requires you performing the same action as the person getting the buff, and also it's going to be different depending on whether you're on front row or versus on the back row. Whereas Hirugami is just a straightforward passive buff that you can trigger every single turn without any kind of like tedious condition that you have to jump through. Okay, so that is going to be my thoughts on Hirugami. If you are planning to pull or summon for him, just remember that right now he is maybe the best mid blocker as it is in terms of blocking. However, even in the future, once we move towards an era where there's going to be even stronger blockers coming out, the value of Hirugami is still going to be there. It's just going to simply shift his role from a dedicated blocker more to a passive buffer. Okay, so that is going to be another reason why you may want to summon for Hirugami. Now, just to close off the video, there's that rumor going around whether or not Sakusa and Komori are going to be the next character afterwards. Now, I still think there's a lot of value for Hirugami, regardless whether or not that rumor is true. So you can definitely, I feel like it's fine for you guys to summon for Hirugami for that reason. If you're a pay-to-win player, you may potentially go all the way to skill resistance 2. However, for Hirugami, I would probably suggest you guys probably just wait till the news is actually confirmed who are going to be the next UR characters coming out before deciding on whether or not you want to take Hirugami from, let's say, 0 dupe to 2 dupes, because I do feel like 2 dupes was is good. It's going to be somewhat more conditional, so you may not actually be able to take full advantage every single time whenever you need it. However, 0 dupe Hirugami just preserves so much value. Just take a look at his buff from skill 1, skill 3. None of them is going to get any stronger. Well, I mean, skill 3 may get a tiny bit stronger from his skill resonance. However, the core mechanics are already there, even if Hirugami is just at 0 dupes, okay? So 0 dupe Hirugami is obviously going to be very strong nonetheless. So if you are still a bit conscious about whether or not the next UR character can potentially be Sakusa or Komori and want to plan a bit around that, then my suggestion is basically just go for only one copy of Hirugami and then wait for the news before deciding on whether or not you want to go for dupes on him. And for the free-to-play players, I still think Hirugami is very good. But once again, if you just want to save up for Komori and Sakusa because they have higher raw stats, etc., you can obviously also wait till towards the end of the banner before deciding whether or not you want to summon for them, because normally we tend to get the news of the next UR character about 2 or 3 days before the banner actually finish, right? So there's no harm in just basically waiting until the last 2 or 3 days before deciding on whether or not you want to summon for Hirugami. Okay, so that's kind of all the things I want to talk about in this video. Let me know what you guys thoughts are and whether or not you are planning to get Hirugami.